Welcome back. You are on United Public Radio, listening to Through a Glass Darkly Radio. And today I have a very interesting guest. But before that, I just want to acknowledge the intro music was Mark of the Doomslayer by Karl Casey at White Bat Audio. You should definitely check it out. And tonight I have a very special guest, one of the greatest horror writers of his generation. Laird Barron is an expat Alaskan. He's the author of several books, including the Imago Sequence and Other Stories, Swift to Chase, and Blood Standard. Currently, Laird lives in the Roundout Valley of New York State and is at work on tales about the evil that men do. So with that, I want to give a warm welcome to Laird Barron. Laird, welcome.
Hi, Sean. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, it's been, I think, 2 years since we last talked, but I think there is a really good reason that you write such compelling fiction, because you've had an extremely interesting life growing up in Alaska, and you've been exposed to a lot of strange occurrences in your neck of the woods. So, for the audience, if you could just tell a little bit, I know I kind of gave them a very truncated bio, but just a little bit about where you're from and kind of what led you to write about many of these experiences or write about things that were inspired by.
Sure. Yeah, I born in Alaska, small town up in Alaska, and we lived rurally for many years. And then when I was about 9 years old, we moved out into the wilderness. They were giving away land parcels, actually, the state was. And so we staked out 10 acres, and it was just like a 3-room cabin. And that's where I spent many years. My dad had sled dogs, uh, hunted, fished, that kind of thing for subsistence. The dogs initially were, for freighting on the Yentna River there, freeze up in the wintertime, and that's how we would travel. Summertime, riverboat. So there were years I never even, saw civilization at all. Uh, and it's funny. I became a horror writer, but when I was young, I was really omnivorous as a reader. I read Robert E.
Mhm.
Howard, Barbara Cartland, Louis L'Amour. I would say the vast majority of my reading probably was other than horror. But, it's a dark, isolated place, Alaska, and we lived in a particularly claustrophobic sort of setting, being surrounded by wilderness, river on one side, and I would say essentially trackless, temperate, almost temperate rainforest on the other, not rainforest, but subarctic kind of forest on the other side, alderbrush, and these things called devil clubs, which are, if you've never been around them, they grow up to like 9 feet tall, and they're just spiked. And so we were, as kids, just sort of trapped there. And Stephen King came along. My mom had a few Stephen King novels lying around. I was kind of hooked on that when I hit about 12, 13 years old. And of course, I found out that I had a talent for frightening my brothers when I would tell them stories. So that's kind of how it all formed. And then when I hit my late 20s and got serious about writing again, I decided to do what I was good at. That was tell frightening tales.
Now, when you were growing up in Alaska, I think a lot of your stories evoke. I'm going to probably mispronounce the word, but genus loci. I don't know, or loci. I
Yeah,
probably
right.
mispronounce it,
Genius loci.
but it's like the Roman for the spirit of a place. Like
Right.
places have resonances, stains, or there's something about a place that is sometimes welcoming, sometimes not so welcoming. Growing up, did you experience anything like that in Alaska?
Yes. And it's interesting. I didn't understand what I was experiencing until I left the state in my early 20s and had been away a year or so. And I went back I was working on a fishing boat. So I went back up to Alaska, and we were out at Dutch Harbor, and there's a bunch of little islands and things out there. And we were visiting one of those just for the day. The crew was doing something with the ship we were on. So we just went out and we're walking around on the island. There was an old bunker for World War II. And it hit me with that feeling that I had felt hundreds of times, if not thousands, throughout my life. Whether it was, be it from when I was a child, or even in my late teens and early 20s when I was mushing sled dogs, and I had never acknowledged it. It's like a background noise when you live there, and uh, it's there, but you don't analyze it. And it hit me really, really hard that we weren't wanted. By we, I mean the crew, all the people who were kind of there was a bunch of college kids from the lower 48. They were, doing the tourist thing for the day, and I felt like a tourist as well because I had been away from that state for about a year at that point, and it was just this overwhelming sense of I want to say dread, but malign. There was like when you can feel someone watching you, and it was broad daylight. I remember I was on a toll, and there were bushes and things, but there was really nowhere for anything big to be hiding, and it was just a general feeling of you're not wanted. And I put that away, and years later when I got serious about writing, I've written essays. I've written multiple essays about how Alaska essentially uses nature as antibodies to discourage people from settling in certain places.
Is there anything particular about some of these places? Any commonalities that distinguish them from others, or is it random?
It's interesting because I've experienced a similar feeling in other places. I was in Montana for a summer, actually a little bit longer. I was about 6-7 months there, and I felt something similar. Essentially, when people are not around, the campsite becomes very strange, and you can feel almost, as the habitation of man recedes, nature is very quick to reclaim it. And that's kind of what I felt, in Alaska, though, the places where I felt it the most, nature had already reclaimed it. This wouldn't be around the cabin necessarily. This would be out with the dogs in desolate places. And I think the sense of being an intruder, like the bunker on that island, everybody else's, and my initial reaction to it was, wow, what a great piece of history, right? And then all of a sudden I was recoiling from it. And I realized in retrospect that essentially it's a wound in the land. Uh, it's a psychic wound, if nothing else, but it's an artifact of war. But I don't mean that it's a wound to the human psyche, but to just, it doesn't belong there. At least that's the feeling that I got from it. We didn't belong there.
And did you have a sense for what was causing this feeling? Like, or was it just this amorphous, you can't
It,
quite put your finger on it?
it's context only, and in retrospect, I feel as if it were just radiating from the landscape in general. And of course, I think there's probably a feedback element. The human psyche is such a wild and mercurial thing, and it's you mix it. If it takes in information, and I think it reaches out on a quantum level, and it has some sort of impact on its surroundings. And I think it's a volatile mixture. So, with whatever presence is there, and I prefer to think of it as an insensate kind of thing, not necessarily like a supernatural element.
Mhm.
Would it react that way to, you know, a fox or a squirrel or an ant? I have no idea, but I do think that there's something particularly abrasive about the human psyche.
Now, in growing up, were there any other incidences that, say, family members like your father may have experienced while out alone in the wilderness, the Alaskan wilderness?
Right, it's an interesting thing. I was surrounded by lore growing up. UFOlogy was really big. There was a lot of paranoia in the 70s and 80s in Alaska about our proximity to Russia.
Mhm.
Um, were we going to be nuked? Were there Russian agents at your school? Your mailman, is he a spy? Um, the Satanic Panic was in the 80s, was in full swing. So we got a lot of, there was a heavy dose. And then of course, Bigfoot has been, crypto, the cryptid question has always, been a big one up in Alaska, just like everywhere else, and in the United States. So there was a lot of, we were getting hit from all directions when I was growing up. And you got to remember also that was the era, especially the 70s, of the occult thriller. Every week there seemed like there was something about, a spin-off of Rosemary's Baby type of thing,
Mhm.
which dealt in paranoia. So surrounded by all this stuff, but nothing ever really happened to me until much later. The wildest, craziest stuff that happened to me occurred years later when I was in my 20s and 30s. So keep that in mind. But my father, he had several incidents, and one of them, I I didn't witness it, but I was around him when it happened. He used to go out. He had a trap line, and he would go out hunting with the team and freighting with the dog team. And of course, by then, this is probably around 83, something like that, somewhere in there, 84 maybe. He was racing the Iditarod, so he had to train the dogs every day and take them out on, just like a marathon runner will. He had to go out and do put some miles on them. And he would run down the river, as I said, frozen, and there was a trail that would go up off the river, and it would go down these geophysical lines. And for the audience who may not be aware of what those are, they're basically anywhere from 40 to 100 feet wide. You can see them when you fly over parts of Alaska. They're just these straight lines that run for miles, and they've done surveys along them. And they've been out there in Alaska probably since the 50s or 60s. So my dad would use those, snowmobilers would go out there and there'd be a trail. And so my dad would use those to train the team. And just out in the middle of nowhere. Like there is, at the time this occurred, our nearest neighbor was probably 20 miles away. That was our next door neighbor. So my dad comes home just about dark with the team, and he was shaking, and he had his rifle out. He usually carried the rifle on the sled in a scabbard, and he had it in one hand, and he was just white as a ghost.
And to be clear, for context, he was a Marine in Vietnam, right?
Right. I was going to get to that. My father did 2 tours in Vietnam. He saw action, as most of the Marines did. And, I'm not going to say that he's some unflappable person, but he was pretty. I mean, you give him a knife and a flint, he'll go out in the woods and come back a few days later and look no worse for the wear. I mean, he's a tough. He was quick to fight. He was a pretty brutal, tough kind of person, and very no nonsense. But he comes back and he pulls into the yard, and he's shaking. He's literally shaking with adrenaline. And so what we got out, long story short is he said that while he was out with the team, he got to a swamp. He came out of the woods, got off the river, went up on this trail for a few miles. And he was probably about 12, 14 miles out. And he turned the team around, and it was, broad daylight at the time. And the dogs started acting kind of odd. They started looking around. They were rolling in the snow and, biting snow and doing what huskies do. And one by one or pair by pair, they started, looking around. And he knew instantly, something's up. But he just figured a moose, maybe a person. There could be a snowmobiler out there or something. But no, there was nothing. And so as he started traveling into the woods again, he heard what he thought at first was a bird call, like a raven. We have a lot of ravens up there. But it wasn't, as far as he was concerned. And like I said, long story short, is he's traveling back along this trail, and of course it's dimmer in the woods. He started hearing somebody shrieking at him. And at first they were shrieking. It sounded like an animal. He said, it's got to be some kind of animal. I just don't know what kind. But then it escalated, and he said by the end, it was laughing. And he said, the only way I can describe it is out of a cheesy horror movie, maniacal laughter. He said, like a person imitating a hyena, something like that. And we don't really have anything, that makes that kind of a noise. And what really alarmed him is it was pacing him in the woods, and he started hearing it on both sides. He would say he was flanked, and the dogs were their fur was, their hackles were up, and they were really agitated. And he was dragging a tire behind him. A lot of times you would drag a tire to slow the team down and make them stronger. He cut that thing loose. He had some weight in the sled. He tossed it, and he said the dogs were just sprinting. They just basically sprinted all the way home. And he said he was in real mortal fear until he dropped down onto the river and got away from the tree line and was able to see for several miles. He could see for over a mile in both directions. And I've never forgotten that one. That was I don't know what he saw, or he didn't see anything, but what he heard, I don't know. He doesn't really have any theories about it, but it frightened him. He didn't use that trail again for a long time, and my father's not the kind of guy to let something like that frighten him. And his last words on it were simply, he was sitting around a few days later, and we were talking, and he said, it sounded like a couple sick people that were just, out of their minds, demented, and were sharing a laugh. He said the other thing that frightened him is when the dogs took off, he was probably traveling around 14 to 16 miles an hour for a few miles there. He was hauling, he said whatever it was kept up with him, not without any problem.
And this was obviously it was during the when there was snow, but was it winter, fall?
Yeah, this was probably I'm guessing this was like December. It was deep snow. It was very cold. That day had probably gotten down to 0, maybe colder. And and all those years, my father, he raced the Iditarod like 20 times, and maybe in excess of that. And he only had like 2 or 3 stories. And all the years that we trained, I mean, you figure we put thousands of miles on the back of a team. He only had 2 or 3 incidents that were what he considered really frightening, and that was the big one. So it wasn't as if he were given to that. The only other thing I'll say about it is that we had multiple. When I say we were surrounded, a lot of people had experiences that lived up and down the river. Like there was a freight pilot. He had a huge barge that he drove up and down the river. In the wintertime, he had a giant alpine snowmobile, and he would haul freight for the different communities along the way. And he had stories, creepy stories, inexplicable stories. Just about everybody had something.
Can you recall any of those stories that freight driver had?
Yeah, the one that hits me is he was talking to my dad about lost time. He lost like a day out of his life. It was in the wintertime. I don't know what year. I'm guessing it was prior to 83. So it might have been 79, 80, somewhere in there. Long story short is he was in a cabin way up in the middle of, it was a place called Whiskey Lake area. And he had a cabin, a summertime or a wintertime cabin up there. Nobody within miles of him, probably 10 miles. And I want the audience to understand that this is not a place you can drive to. This is literally in the wintertime, you'd have to take a dog team or a ski plane or a snowmobile, something like that. In the summertime, a float plane or a boat. That's it. So he, very remote, and he had this cozy little cabin, and he went out to, I can't remember what it was. I think he may have had a trap line. He was doing something on his snowmobile, and he said he was traveling along this hill, this big old hill, and he looked up because something out of the corner of his eye caught his attention. He realized it was like he thought it was a snow slide because there was something big moving toward him. And he looked, and the next thing he remembered is 24 hours had passed, and he was sitting in his chair, just sitting there. The house was getting cold because the fire had gone out, and he was just sitting in his chair. And he was wearing all his work clothes and stuff, but he had no memory of about 24 hours. The last thing that had happened was about 6 in the evening, right when it was getting dark. And when he came to, it was like a blank. It was about 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the evening. And he was trying to remember what happened because it took him he was really disoriented. But where it gets really, I would say far-fetched, except that I knew him and he was really level-headed guy. Mm-hmm. Teetotaler, the whole thing. He said that somebody knocked on his door, which he said he was so surprised, but he was also so discombobulated from, this was like within minutes of him waking up. He goes to the door and opens it, and there was, I can't remember if there's one or two, but there was at least one guy standing there, black sunglasses, wearing all dark winter gear.
Men in Black? Like a Men in Black sort of?
Interesting. Now, keep in mind, when we heard this story, we'd never heard of that term. He was telling us this like in 84, 85. So I was not aware of the term. Maybe he was. But the point is, yeah, this guy starts talking to him. And he said he didn't understand most of what he was saying. He was speaking English, but in a way that he didn't really follow. Like every third word was completely foreign to him. And the guy asked him if he was okay, asked him some questions, and said, "All right, see you later." And he turned around and he walked away. And Frank goes back into the house.
No vehicle, nothing.
Nope. And so he just walks away, and he goes, he told me not to talk about it. Basically, that was the thrust of the conversation. He said it lasted about a minute or two. It was a very short conversation. The guy asked him a few questions, and then he said, I wasn't really in any condition to even really be coherent. And then he left, and he goes, he sat there, and by the time he got his act together and kind of felt like himself again, it was already dark, and he fell asleep. He just fell asleep, like exhausted. So the next day he went out and, oh, by the way, his snowmobile, this is the part that he said really freaked him out. He said, on top of everything else, the snowmobile should have been down to almost empty fuel. It was full. So he jumps on his snowmobile and he followed the tracks and they just stopped. They just went out. They were following a trail. They were like on the trail that leads to his house, but they just went for a little way and he said, I didn't find any other sign of a vehicle or anything. They were just 1 minute they were there, and next minute he couldn't find him anymore, and that was that.
And if it were snowing, there wouldn't be tracks to begin with at all. So it was obviously enough time for him to follow a
Yeah,
set of tracks that were laid down, and there's
yeah.
no other explanation for the tracks beyond that to be gone, at least
Yep.
conventional.
Oh,
Right.
and one other thing about that story is I was trying to remember the part of the reason that he thought he was all freaked out because he thought there was a snow slide, even though it was not that big a hill, it wasn't a mountain, is the snowmobile was dying on him. That was the other thing, is the snowmobile was sputtering, like all of a sudden it just started, and it kind of stopped him there, and it didn't completely die. I don't think he was trying to get it going, but it was like, ugh, and he was cranking on it, and all of a sudden something caught his attention, and then that was the end. So there you go. That was his creepy, inexplicable
There's
tale.
actually a physicist. His name is Dr. Kevin Knudsen, and he actually looked at some of these, UFO sightings, etc., where a car would die, and he just analyzed the physics of a motor, and just as it's like a sinusoidal wave. But when you do the analysis, I think he came up with something like, I'm going to get the number wrong, but some percentage of the time your car will shut off, but sometimes it won't. It just depends on when this electromagnetic disturbance happens. And if you look at all the kind of events and you tabulate them, that kind of percentage is pretty close to what you would expect. So in other words, one could speculate there was some sort of electromagnetic disturbance that was impacting his vehicle, his snowmobile.
And he wasn't I don't have stories for the other people, but just to say that the Iditarod is about 11 to 1200 miles long, and back in those days it was about a 2 week. For the average finisher, it was between 14 and 17, 18 days. And I won't say it was common, but anecdotally, my dad and at least 4 or 5 other mushers over the years have discussed missing time on the Iditarod, and it was usually about a day. One friend of ours, she actually had kept a journal, and she was scoffing at the whole missing time thing. And it had taken her a long time. She had kind of raced the Iditarod her year, just kind of non-competitively. She just kind of took it as a trip. So she had a nice trip, right? And she's like, no, I never had anything weird happen. What do you guys always, you guys are all superstitious. But when she went through her journal, she realized that she was missing a day out of her journal, which we all kind of chuckled. And when she tried to recreate where she was that day, she couldn't do it. So it's not that uncommon for people in Alaska to miss time.
Is there a day, or sorry, not a day? Is there a particular location, if she had looked at her journal, where this tends to happen, or is it?
Oh yeah, there's two.
Really?
Yeah, there's kind of two places on the Iditarod that people either have creepy, like I had creepy experience, feelings, and I found out that other people, a lot braver than me, mountain men types, have had, oh yeah, that's a bad spot. Keep moving when you go through there. Outside of Iditarod, either leaving Iditarod or coming into it, and if you look at a map, anybody can pull up a map of Alaska and just type in Iditarod. It was a gold mining, gold rush town, and at one point back during the gold rush era, it had, I think, upwards of 30,000 people were temporarily there, and it's still, these old ruins are out there. And the town itself, I've never heard any creepy stories about it, but it's kind of desolate. These hillocks that just go forever. And then when you leave Iditarod, depending on what year it is, there's the next checkpoint's a native village called Shagaluk, and traveling into Shagaluk can be, I want to say it's about 650 or 60 miles overland from Iditarod, but it's these gigantic hills, no trees or very few trees, but it's just I never knew anything about it first time I went through it, and I was looking over my shoulder the whole way. I just, there's no heavy brush or anything, but it's just this feeling of dread. And when I was talking to people about it later, they're like, "Oh yeah, that's the place. You keep moving through there." But people have lost time kind of through that stretch. That's where it happened.
So is that the gold mining town and then Chagaluk, are they two separate
Yeah,
places? Or okay,
right.
okay.
Like I said, anybody can pull. It's real simple. You just pull up the map and type in Iditarod, and you'll see that just south of Iditarod, uh, I don't know how many miles it is because the trail miles are far different than air miles, but by the trail, it's going south to Takatna, or excuse me, Ophir. You can get a theme here, with the old the mining towns like Ophir, right? But I'm surprised they're not in El Dorado. But so you have, if you're heading north, you have Ophir, which was a mining, people still mine there. Then you go over this godforsaken stretch of land, and you're in Iditarod, which is the ghost town. And then you go another 50, 60 miles, more godforsaken terrain, and you're in Shagaluk.
Are there any people living in Chagaluk?
Yeah, the natives live there. Matter of fact, the Yukon, everywhere we stop on the Yukon's a like native village. There's just depends on what year, because there's two routes. The Iditarod has a northern and a southern route. So I've never spent much time in any of those places. I've been to them exactly three times. I raced the Iditarod three times, and I wasn't hanging out.
Yeah, you don't have time, right? Now, I think there was one Iditarod that you almost died, right?
Yeah, 1991. I was in White Mountain, made famous by old Johnny Horton, right? Um, and I left. I was told, oh yeah, the weather's going to be clear because it's about 80 miles from there to Nome, but you have to travel. You're traveling along the Bering Sea, and you're inland a little bit, but you can see the sea in places if the weather's clear. But you have to go over some gigantic hills, and when I say big hills, I mean bigger than the Catskills. I mean we're talking huge, like not vertical, but like if you fell down, you'd slide on your face all the way back down to the bottom. And a windstorm came up. The gusts were up to 80 miles an hour, and it was probably 0 to 20 below, something like that. Wind chills we figured were 80, 90 below, and I was stuck out in that for 36 hours, and that was a pretty awful. I'm lucky to be here. That I froze my hands, I froze my face, I froze my foot. But the dogs and I made it. But that was a pretty drastic or a dire situation to be in.
Well, when you got to the hospital, weren't your like feet encased in blocks of ice or something crazy like that?
Yeah, my right foot. What had happened is I was wearing those old Navy boots, those huge, they call them bunny boots, and they're really tough. But unknowingly I had sliced my right boot open, and my foot had frozen, and you know I didn't even realize it. It hurt, but I didn't. I never had anything like that happen. So my foot was frozen. So I get to the finish, and my foot was frozen probably for about 2 or 3 days. And so I get to Nome, and I happen to be staying with because they put you up with the host family in Nome usually.
Hmm.
So I was staying with the doctor, and he looked at my foot, and he almost fainted. He says, "Okay, we gotta get you to the hospital." So they took me to the Nome hospital the next day, and I remember, they basically had to pry my sock was welded into my foot, so they had to pry all that loose. And I was walking to this room where they were gonna put me in warm water to kind of thaw me out, and my foot was clacking. It was making this like Fred Astaire tapping sound as I walked. It was bad, um, and doctors were really wanting to amputate big portions of it and all that, but I got lucky and that didn't happen.
Now, you mentioned Nome. I have to ask anything, not just to you, but when you're talking to the locals, any strange happenings there in
Not,
Alaska?
that's a good one. I've never actually heard anything personally about Nome, but I'm sure that they have their stories. I mean, all the villages on either side of Nome certainly do. So I bet Nome has its share. Um, so not Nome, but there's a place called Koyuk over on the Norton Sound, and then my dad, he was traveling back in, I want to say 81, 82, something like that. He was traveling from Koyuk to Elam, and you have to cut out across the ice to do it. So instead of following the coast makes like a big, almost like a horseshoe. So you would travel like 160 miles if you were following the coast. So you could make about a 50 or 60 mile if you just go across the ice, and it's frozen, so it's safe. And my dad was out there, and he wasn't too far from Elam, but it was like 2 in the morning, pitch black. It was snowing, and it was that fine, really fine snow that it'll throw your light back at you, so you can't see. He could barely even see the wheel dogs. And all of a sudden, he got this bad vibe, and he saw a huge shadow. He looked at it, but of course, the lighting was terrible. But he could see it. It was big, and it was pacing the team, and it was the size of a bear. And before it was over, there were several, and they were all around him. And he's tired. This is like 13, 14 days into a race. He's just exhausted. And he really thought that these were polar bears, because this is March. It's 12 degrees, whatever it is. There's there's not going to be one bear, much less 5 or 6, roaming on the sea ice. And so he thought, oh my God, a polar bear, but we're so far south of Kotzebue, places where they really are. How could that be? Anyway, dogs were acting freaky, didn't like it. Eventually, he gets into the checkpoint, and he was telling one of the elders about it. And he said, yeah, I had this horrible feeling about it too. Like malevolent almost. And I can't remember what the term was, because I don't think my dad ever learned it, so he didn't share that with us. But he said they were just, that the elders were just like, huh, yeah, that's a spirit. Those are the spirits that were going to lead you out to open water, or drive you out to open water, or whatever. You're lucky that you didn't die.
Wow. I think there's another story you tell about you're on the Iditarod and you actually felt someone pointing a rifle at you, or at least surveilling you in some way.
Oh no,
going nuts.
That was did we talk about? I think we might have talked about.
Or sled dogs. I don't know if it was the Iditarod, but it was you with the sled dogs.
Yeah, well, it's Alaska, right? Everybody's really you have a lot to worry about, or you did in the 70s and 80s growing up in Alaska. You had, especially out in the woods, you had a lot to worry about. And yeah, it was probably the only weird thing that ever happened to me. I had some odd things happen, but it was like the only almost supernatural thing that I had happen. I was out training the team, and this was 1994. So it's right before I left Alaska, a few months before I left. But I had the team, or maybe late 93. But the point is, it was right around there. And I was way up on a mountain with the dog team, and I was going along an actual power line, the type,
what state was this in again? Sorry.
It was Alaska.
Okay. All right. It's before you went to the race. Okay.
Yeah. And, like I said, you and I have talked about it before. Despite all my experiences and my fascination with the subject, I'm a bit of a skeptic, because I believe that the mind is a very intricate device, and it will kind of feed you whatever you want to believe. It will try to supply information if you don't have all the pieces. But
right, pareidolia, right? Yeah, pareidolia is real,
right? So, but I'm not a fool either, and I have had some strange things happen, and this was one of the stranger ones in Alaska. I was out with the team, and I had run this trail because a lot of times you use the same trails over and over, and so it's kind of old hat. But it was probably about a 40-mile round trip, so I was about 20 miles from. I had parked I had put the team in a truck and taken them to the head, kind of like where the trail begins. And it was in a parking lot of this mushing association. And then I went up into the wilderness. And so this wasn't the deep woods where I was raised. This was nearer civilization. But nonetheless, I was up on a mountain, and I was up on basically a logging trail / power line. And it was the big power lines. It's the big, I don't know the term for it, but they're big X's, the big kind of like the Roman crosses up there, and 30 feet tall.
Like transformers, basically.
Yeah, there were transformers. There was and the big hills. They go up over the hills. So, I went about 20 miles, and I was up on, and like once again, it's about the size of the Catskills, maybe a tiny bit bigger. So I'm up on the top of the Catskills essentially in Alaska, and I come around a corner, and it's bright daylight. It's probably like 3 p.m, so it's about an hour until it starts getting dark. And up ahead, about half a mile, the trail kind of made a T, and snowmobilers had been using it, so it was all very easy traveling for me. And there was like a hill there, and it was real shallow, and it was really wide, and it would be an easy place to turn my team around because I had 16 dogs. So I was like looking for a wide area to turn the team, and I never made it there because I had this. This is what was really, really odd. Wide awake, no stimulant, something like that. I had that experience everybody always talks about, leaving your body. Well, I had that once when I was drowning. I had it when I was stuck in the storm, and I had it this time. And I literally had this optical illusion, or some kind of, it was a delusional feeling of being outside my body, looking at myself. And I was up on top of that hill, peeking over, like over, through a bush, and I could see my dog team approaching, and I couldn't see my face, but I could see me standing behind the team, and I had this overwhelming feeling of malevolence, of laughter, of joy, and it lasted probably 3 seconds. I mean, it was long enough that it was really disorienting, and I snapped back into my body. And, I write it off these days as just, obviously I was hallucinating. But the part that kind of makes it a little bit eerier is the dogs all started looking up there. Maybe they were feeding off me. Dogs are really, you get really close to your team.
Were you looking in that direction, or
we were facing that direction?
Okay.
They weren't looking at me, but they all started. A couple of them started barking. And sled dogs, unlike the movies where the dogs all bark, they don't do that after you've been out for 2 hours on the trail. They pant in unison. The only time they'll bark is if you stop for too long, then they'll maybe. But no, the dogs were unhappy. Their hackles were up. Some of them were growling. A couple of them started barking. And anybody's ever been in a bad situation, cops, soldiers, they will say when you get that kind of a feeling, you don't second guess it. You get out of that situation. I knew that if I kept going, something bad was going to happen. And what it felt like is if somebody was staring down a rifle scope at me, is what it felt like. Were they? Probably not. It was probably a hallucination, but it was damn convincing one. So I turned around, and the dogs had never run that trail back to the truck faster. And I'm not ashamed to admit it was dark by the time I pulled into the parking lot. It was like just a sliver of Dracula sunlight, like it was going down over the castle. And the whole time that I'm loading my team up, because I had about a 10-mile drive back to my house, I kept expecting. I would not have been surprised if somebody would have come running down the trail after me or something. So there you go.
Okay. Now, I think I'm going to ask one last question. You might not have anything to say about this. I think before we started the radio show, you had mentioned something about stories around harp, not with you personally, but lore in the area you may have heard growing up. Anything about that at all?
No, just that there were people that were some of the old timers were very suspicious of it and what it was really being used for. Obviously it was supposed to be used for imaging, for mineral reserve or deposits and things like that. But there were people that are, there's a lot of speculation in Alaska being so huge about undisclosed military installations and things like that.
Okay, fair enough. I'm not gonna push on that one. All right. Now, I think you had mentioned at the beginning of this interview that a lot of the strange stuff that happened to you really ramped up actually after you left Alaska. I think you spent some time in Washington State. You also spent some time in Montana, and then now you're in the Hudson Valley, right, where there was a slate of UFO sightings back in the maybe 80s or 90s.
But yeah, I was shocked to see that it's not Nevada. It's the Hudson Valley that has kind of the world champion UFO sighting, kind of trophy.
Well, there's a lot of nuclear assets in New York. I think that's part of the explanation behind that. But
Lots of cryptid sightings. Bigfoot. When we moved into the area that we're in, we're kind of mid Hudson Valley, almost upstate, and we just moved recently into a new place, and so obviously I did my due diligence. The first thing the neighbor told me is, "Oh, you're a writer. Oh, there's all kinds of scary stories around here," and they were regaling me with all the haunted resorts and Bigfoot sightings and all that. So it's kind of a hotbed of and then I looked it up, and yeah, it's off and on. It's a hotbed of activity around here.
all right, so I guess starting maybe in Washington State, I think you had some experiences there.
Yeah, I'll tell you, man. It could just be that I was so busy trying to survive when I lived in Alaska that I didn't, that the only thing that would ever stick out to me would be like if I had seen a UFO or some giant hominid roaming through the trees, that it would have taken something like that to get my attention. Because when I lived in Washington State, the first few years I lived there, nothing really too out of the ordinary happened. But I started seeing somebody, and we just had a lot of, I shouldn't say a lot, but we had several really creepy experiences, and they persisted from place to place. They were different from place to place, but just odd stuff. Like the apartment. Actually, there's a scene. I wrote a novel a few years ago, a horror novel, and there's a scene in it where someone talks. The cat says something to, they go down the cellar, and the cat whispers, to them. And that was taken from something that happened. I didn't witness this. Matter of fact, at the time, I was really kind of a jerk. I was totally just like, yeah, this didn't happen. But my girlfriend at the time said, yeah, she that the cat in the house that she was staying at the time, one of her roommates, the cat said, somebody was either playing a joke, or the cat said something to her when she was down in the basement. And so I put that. I ended up putting in the novel because it was really creepy. But I was like, yeah, right. Until until I started hearing weird things around our apartment later, and I said, okay, maybe I was hasty in my judging this. Um, yeah, we heard voices occasionally. Things got moved. There was one incident that may or may not have been supernatural, but it was certainly creepy. I actually called a police officer to come and take a report, just out of to get the paperwork started.
Yeah.
Yeah. And like, for example, I remember one night I was sitting there watching TV, and she was doing something. It was a tiny apartment, and so she was on the other side of a partition, and I said something to her. She said something to me like, "Hey, I love you," and I said, "I love you," and then a third person goes, "I love you," about 5 feet away from me. And at the time, I had all my hearing. Like these days, I only have one ear, one eye, one ear. My lung, I have half my lungs missing. A piece at a time, as Johnny Cash used to say in that song. But at the time, I was, my hearing was pretty good, and I froze because it was not her. And then about, I'd say 5 seconds later, she goes, "Was that you?" I said, "No, it wasn't." And then we were off to the races after that. The apartment became, luckily we were going to move. We moved out about a year later, but the apartment became almost untenable for us. So much just unpleasant stuff happened in the place. And, you know, I'm prepared to accept that it was shared hallucination, that maybe there was a human element. Somebody was messing with us. Somebody had access to the apartment, some stuff like that. Doesn't really matter. It was just on the face of it. It was really, really creepy. And like I said, voices. I only had the one voice, but she heard on a couple occasions somebody snickering in the apartment. And if it was anything like what I heard, the difference between the next door coming through the wall and something that's just a couple feet away. I was so freaked out. I looked for microphones. Like there was a beanbag chair, and I tore it apart, looking for microphones and stuff like that. One time we went out, I had gotten to the point where I was really worried that somebody might be breaking into the apartment. I actually put thread across the three major openings, the door, the sliding glass door, and the window, and very thin. So if anybody opened it, I'd know. And we came home one day, and I would put things like, if you open the door more than a couple inches, you knock something over, that kind of stuff. It was just rudimentary. People probably still could have circumvented it, but I was trying. And we came home one day after being out for about an hour, and my girlfriend kind of screamed, and I went in, and she goes, "Look!" And I was looking in the bathroom, and something was wrong. I didn't realize what it was for a second, and then it hit me. The shower curtain had frogs on it, cute little frogs, cartoon frogs. It had been turned around. It was reversed. Somebody had pulled it off the shower rod and reversed it. So, whether that was delusion, a poltergeist, or the landlord, this is a big apartment with like 400 people in it. So, somebody with a key. I don't care which of those things it was. It was.
But wouldn't someone with a key have disrupted the lines?
Yeah, that's what I assume. Another time when I was at the place, when we were still living there, I was talking to her. I was really tired. I was working this really exhausting job at the time, and it was my day off, and I was half asleep. And you lock the door, and then we had a deadbolt and a big thick key to, from the outside you could activate the deadbolt. And after about the fourth time of trying to because I kept locking it, but it wouldn't lock, and I tried to lock it again. And after about the third or fourth time, my girlfriend grabbed my arm, and she was very petite, not particularly strong. I thought she was gonna leave like fingerprints in my arm. She squeezed my arm. She goes, "Look," and the deadbolt on the other side activated on its own. Chunk! Or deactivated. So basically, every time I was turning the key, I would pull the key out, and somebody on the other side would unlock the door again, because you could unlock it on the other side, obviously. I have no explanation for that. There was nobody in the apartment, but it happened. And the fourth time I'm watching it happen, I went, okay, yeah, that's pretty creepy. So eventually we moved out of there, but that kind of stuff followed us around. Interestingly, we finally bought a house about 6-7 years later. We bought a house, and I lived in the house for a few years, and the only like one or two things ever happened there toward the very end. So in other words, it wasn't like everywhere we went. It was but it was very concentrated in 2 or 3 places. So, like I said, I'm a skeptic, but I also, these things happened. I just don't.
Mm-hmm.
I don't presume to know what it means.
The mechanism is right.
Yeah, and for me, when stuff happens in your home like that, it doesn't really matter what it is. It's not comfortable.
Okay, actually, there's one story in Alaska that I forgot to ask you about. I think you did some open sea Alaskan crab fishing. Is that right, or was it?
No, I never did any crab fishing, but I've been out.
It's like oil platforms.
Oh, no, I was on the oil spill, the '89 Exxon Valdez cleanup. I did that for a few months, but I was only on. Story? Yeah, well, it depends on what the story is. I don't know.
The arm wrestling guy.
Oh yeah, right. I mean, life is strange enough, right? Yeah. So, but basically, what that was is, instead of fishing that year, a lot of people in the business were cleaning beaches, and all the tenders and all the crabbers and all those guys, they were renting out their boats to, the cleanup crews. And there was this one crew. They had this kid on the crew. He's probably 19, 20, and he was like Tarzan. He was like a perfect specimen, 6 foot, probably around 200 pounds, and just made out of steel. And I remember one time watching him, they were timing him skinning a halibut, and he like skin the halibut in like 20 seconds. It was just this amazing feat. But this arm wrestling thing started, arm wrestling tournament, because there were a lot of, macho dudes. It was like pretty much, I would say, 200 dudes and like 2 or 3 women that were out there at the time. So a lot of testosterone, right? So the arm wrestling tournament began. this guy destroyed. I can't remember how it was organized, but it went over like about a 3-day period. And he had this, it was like something out of a Hollywood movie. When he would go up against whomever the best was, they could come up against him. They would be doing their thing, and he'd go, "Are you ready?" And he'd slam them, just like push their arm over like nothing. And I watched him take.
This is the Tarzan dude.
Yeah. I don't know what his name was. I never even talked to him. I didn't arm wrestle him. I was like, no. So anyway, he's destroying everybody, and I forget what happened, but this little guy I was working with, 5'7", 150, 160 pounds, probably about his late 20s. He had a pot belly. He's a skinny guy, but he had like a Yogi Bear pot belly. He's a chain smoker. Like, he's literally always had a butt hanging out of the corner of his mouth while and when we were working, because I really liked him, but like I'd have to carry his load for him a lot of the time, because he just, he literally would like, I'm carrying 40 pounds. That's all I could take. And so he said, I'll arm wrestle him. And I don't think it was part of the tournament. He just, after it was all over, he said, I'll do it. And he put a bunch of money down. They had like $200 or $300. Boom. And they had this barrel they were doing it on. I said, okay. And so they went at it, and I figured he'd get his arm snapped off. I mean, he has no muscle on him at all. And he was outweighed by at least 60 pounds by this other guy. They go to arm wrestle, and he looks at him, and he's smoking, and he smiles at him, and he goes, I swear he took a cigarette out, and he goes, all right, are you ready? And he slammed him. He just pushed the guy's arm over like nothing. There was no straining. He just literally just pulled him over, and he didn't.
The skinny guy did that to the Tarzan guy.
Yeah. And listen, I know a little bit about arm wrestling. I've arm wrestled a few hundred times in my day, amateur stuff. Everybody throws their weight. They try to get under the table. They try to, get the arm close to the body. Use your weight. He just sat standing straight up. He maybe leaned forward a little, and he literally just used his shoulder and his arm and just pulled the guy over. And the other guy was like doing everything right. He was like literally hanging on his arm. So I'm flabbergasted. And I said to him, I tried arm wrestling him just to see because I was pretty good. And I wanted to see if he was, because he said, no, I'm not sandbagging. I'm not very strong. He goes, I said, man, I'm always carrying your bags for you. Are you just sandbagging me? He's like, no. He goes, I'm just good at arm wrestling. And so I arm wrestled him, and he just like a baby. Like, he just pulled my arm over. And it wasn't because he was strong. He was just literally like if you were trying to stop a car from rolling, it's just going to keep going. So I said, well, what's your secret? And he says, well, I can't be picked up either if I don't want to be. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He goes, I was told really early in life, one of his uncles or somebody had said, just imagine that there's a beam, like a piece of iron going through from outer space, and it goes right through the center of the earth, and then it goes through your body. You're immovable. That's it. And you can move it, and you can move that bar this way or that way. So in other words, if anything attached to it is gonna go when you want it to go. And he says, I can't be picked up, and I can't be beaten arm wrestling.
So did he win the tournament, or did he just beat the Tarzan?
Well, I don't know if he won the tournament, but he beat the winner of the tournament. I mean, that guy had destroyed everyone, and it was like something out of a William Goldman novel. It was, I mean, literally, it was. I wouldn't believe it if I hadn't seen it. I don't expect anybody to believe it, but and then his explanation, and he was just really humble, real casual. There was no jiving. He was just sort of, he says, yeah, he goes, I'm not strong. I'm not I don't have any secret techniques. He goes, I just can't be moved if I don't want to be moved.
Unreal.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else in Washington State that may have happened?
Yeah, we don't have time for all the stuff that happened, but
no, we still have another hour.
So. I would say that we had to leave. So we were living in Seattle, moved out of that creepy apartment, and we moved into an even creepier place up in Olympia, outside of Olympia. And it was this old, it had been remodeled, but it was this old house that dated back to like the 1840s. And we didn't know this at the time. It was like a little 2-story house, nothing special about it. It had, original floors, but, pine floors and whatnot, but nothing, when we first moved in, I just liked it. I thought it was pretty nice. It was on an old kind of, quiet like an acre, and it was big, like the big Douglas fir behind the house. So it was very, there were people around, but we were about 20 minutes from the nearest town type of thing. And I never got any weird vibes or anything until we'd been there a while. But we found out later that it was a trading post, and it had been built on native land, and of course, everything was, but like it had been specifically built like near graveyards and things like, or burial grounds and stuff. And so there was a lot of like hard feelings about the place, and it had been burned down at one time and then rebuilt, etc. So that was, I really tried to play off the stuff that was happening there, but it became so overt that when my girlfriend at the time said, we have to move. We'd only been there like 10 months. She said, we have to move. We have to leave. I said, sure. I understood, but yeah, mostly it was just weird sounds. Like I remember we would used to hear like footsteps on the, like very clearly. You'd be lying in bed and wake up because you could hear somebody on the stairs. And we're talking like not the creaking of a house, but like thump, 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 creak, and then maybe going back down the stairs. And I used to get up and look around. There was nothing. And so I started just sort of zeroing it out. Like, this is not, this isn't really happening. And I was writing a story called Old Virginia one afternoon. And
great story.
There's a scene. There's a scene in there where all the team, a bunch of CIA operatives, soldiers, and whatnot.
And this is like out. Old Virginia, as in like Virginia Dare, right? The
exactly.
first.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay.
So
I won't give more away, but it's a great story.
The main character is all by himself in this remote cabin, and all his buddies are out doing, a patrol, looking for somebody, and he hears the floorboard creak behind him, and he turns and sees something that should not be happening in that cabin. I'm not kidding you. I'm writing that scene, and behind me in the main living room, I'm all alone. The house shook. Something crashed to the floor as I was writing that scene. I got the part where he heard the creak, and I'm like, and or the perennial author question, and or, yeah, that or which, and boom, the house shakes, and it sounded like a dresser had been slammed. I mean, it was loud. I almost jumped through the window. It's because I was in that scene, and of course there was nothing there. But then I started going, what's going on around here? And it kind of came to a head. We used to hear knocking on the walls, at day or night, didn't matter. Like literally, like I don't know if you can hear it over, but like that loud. But imagine, I don't have a wall next to me, but like the thump, it would be between the windows. Middle of the day, we'd be making coffee, doing something, and you'd hear like that. Or sometimes just like a thud. All different places. One night we were sitting there watching TV, and it was so loud on the wall nearest us that the picture there fell on the floor. And I was out like a shot. I was outside looking to see if somebody had hit us with a rock. But see, the thing was, it didn't sound like a rock. It sounded like, something thicker or not thicker, but giving. And so that happened all the time. We heard drilling. I remember one afternoon we're standing in the kitchen, and I heard, and it was shaking the floor. There's drilling coming up out of the floor. The house had a skirting, and then it was locked. There was one way in and out. And there was a padlock on it. I unlocked the padlock. There was cobwebs. When I opened it, nothing. It was a crawl space. You really couldn't, there was nobody under there with the drill. So these are fairly innocuous, like nothing to get too excited about. But when they're happening to you, they're a little bit like, what's going on around here? Steps up, footsteps, knocking on the walls at all hours, that kind of thing. But it came to a head after we'd been there about 9 or 10 months. We were getting ready to go to work. It was like 6 o'clock in the morning, very dark, cold. So this was probably October, November, and November, I guess. And it was unseasonably cold for that time of year. And I remember we were trying to heat up the truck. The truck would die, so one of us had to sit there and warm it up. So my girlfriend, I get it going, kind of getting it warmed up. She's sitting there, keeping it running. I said, let me check the mail. And so I walked up to the the road. I grabbed the mail, and out of the corner of my eye, because how was I kind of turned and I caught like wasn't out of the corner of my eye. I was kind of turning, and I saw movement in the house. And of course, it's pitch black outside, but we had all the lights on. And upstairs there was a bathroom, and it was dark, but the window was looking over the yard. And then our bedroom was on the other side, and the light was on. And I realized what I was looking at. There was no light coming out of the upper. There were a second before it had been all lit up. I could see our bedroom, clearly. It's black, and I'm kind of like trying to understand what I'm seeing. And then all of a sudden, the blackness just withdrew, like somebody crumpling. Like imagine there was a sheet over the window, and somebody just it's gone. But it kind of crumpled, and then the light was shining through again. I saw that clear as day. The window was pitch black, and then boom, something was taken. So something was standing in the window. Somebody was standing in the window, or I was imagining it. So I didn't tell her what it was. I just went, I gotta go check. So I said, honey, I gotta make a sweep of the house. I'll be right back. And she's like, by this point, she didn't. I mean, every place was so weird. She understood. So I go inside. I checked everywhere. There's nobody. There was nothing going on in the house. So she takes me to work. She goes back. We only had the one vehicle. So I'm working at this box store. And at about 10 o'clock in the morning, the boss comes up to me and goes, Laird, your wife's here. Your girlfriend's here. And I said, what's the matter? He goes, she's got some kind of problem. And so I went out and talked to her, and she was in a state. She had called the police to the house, the whole 9 yards. And of course, they thought she was nuts. But basically, what happened is when she went home, all hell broke loose, according to her. The doors started opening, closing downstairs, slamming. She heard the toilet flush. She heard, like, you name it, Amityville horror. It was going on downstairs. And she said the part that terrified her the most is that she heard somebody dragging something heavy and metallic across the tiles in the kitchen and in the hallway. And then she heard, according to her, somebody climbing the stairs, but loud, like thump, thump, and then running. That's the one that got her, where she called the cops because she heard bump, 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 right up to the top landing and then nothing. And she's, out of her mind with terror. And so yeah, we moved out of there shortly thereafter, actually.
And well, I mean, you already talked about some of the history behind the land there, right?
Yeah,
With,
and
you know,
right, and we found a arrowhead in the yard. So I mean, there might have been some truth to it. I took all this with a grain of salt. This is just what we were told. The coda to that story is, so we tell the landlord, that we need to move. We didn't tell him why. We just said we found another place. We're leaving. He says,
he
"Oh,
probably
okay."
knew.
Well, what's interesting, he did know. We found out later that he and 3 other people had formed a band, and they had lived in there for a few years, and they were all initially going to own the place together. He ended up buying them out because the other 3 band members were scared of the place. So we talked to one of them, and they said, that place is. I said, did anything really horrible ever happen? He goes, nope. He goes, but he described like pretty weird stuff, but nothing. Nobody got levitated and thrown out a window or anything like that. But he said slamming doors, screaming from under the house, just you name it. And my girlfriend at the time, she was having nightmares about somebody under the house being tortured or that somebody had been hurt under the house and left under there. So the coda though is, he said, hey, I've got some people coming to look at the house, and we had boxes of stuff everywhere. And we're like, okay. And they came over in the evening, and it was a nice family, and they had like 3 kids, and the kids were all like between 5 and 8 years old, something like that. And so we're all kind of sitting around talking, and the landlord was there, and he was kind of acting fidgety. The kids, of course, like little chicks, they just boom scattered, and they're like slamming every door in the house. Every freaking door in the house got slammed about 20 times immediately. I'm like, children. And we're all kind of smiling. And one of the kids, like the middle, like 6-year-old girl, she comes up and she like looks up at me and she goes, is this house haunted? And I got ready to give her a straight up answer, like, yeah, get out. But I looked over at the landlord, and he was just like, he just had this look, his pop, he's just like looking at me. I said, well, I don't know. I don't know if I believe in ghosts. And so they didn't they didn't rent the place anyway. But the coda to the coda is some other people rented it and they lasted. We never talked to them. We don't know what happened, but it was a nice young couple. We ran into somebody that said, "Oh yeah, Bill and Mary moved in that place you guys were at." They lasted 3 months and they were out of there. That's highly unusual for renting this place was $1,000 a month. That's not, it was a house for a family. It was too big for us anyway, just the two of us. But yeah, the next people that stayed there didn't last 3 months. They were gone.
All right. And then I think you head to Montana.
Yeah. Montana was pretty, I was only there for 7 months. The only thing that happened in Montana is just, I'll touch on it briefly, was just that I was staying with my brother. I'd gotten divorced and I was going to eventually move to the East Coast, but I really needed to finish The Croning. That was that horror novel I've been talking about. And get my act together. And so my brother goes, well, we have 30 acres. It's up literally in the mountains on a logging road out in the middle of nowhere. We have lots of extra space. You want to rent like a little attached cabin from us? Come do it. And so I stayed there from spring until almost the first snow. And they were moving out. It turned out that I came at a kind of a tumultuous time. They were going to move into Helena, which is a city. And so they were in the process of moving toward the end of that summer. And consequently, I was there alone for about 10 days, kind of at the tail end of all this. And part of the reason is that they had a horse that they couldn't move right away. So I was taking care of the horse. And also there was a cat that had decided to run off. And so she did that occasionally. She'd go off on an expedition safari. So I was like, I'm not leaving until we get the cat back. And they're like, hey, thanks. So I spent about 9 days, just me and my dog, and nothing bad happened. Well, actually, a couple creepy things did happen, but I don't know if you qualify it as bad, or characterize as bad. But the overarching feeling that I had was not wanted. Like every day I was there, the place just became more like lonely and you don't really belong here. And my dog started acting squirrely. But what happened is, and old John Langan can tell you, I don't think he saw it because I don't think I had the camera on, but he certainly heard me yell. So while they were gone, they'd been gone about 3 days. I was in the main house making some tea because I didn't have anything in my cabin. So I'm sitting there making tea, my dog's at my feet, and I was talking to John Langan, famous horror writer, on Google Hangouts, if anybody's old enough to remember those things. And
But they still exist, and Google still uses them.
Well, some of those old guys still exist too. I don't use it anymore. Yeah. But so we were chatting on that, and it was kind of spotty because it's Montana, but we had a phone line run up to the cabin, so that was nice. So I'm sitting there, and I look down at my dog, and she's not upset, but she's doing this thing that she's turning her head like she's trying to understand. And I just had this feeling, and I turn, and the bedroom, my brother's master bedroom door, it's like a Viking longhouse. So it's like one long room, and then there's a kitchen and a bathroom and some stuff. But their bedroom's like the only other real room besides the bathroom. So the house was like 40 years old, and it had settled. You could take, if you start from their bedroom, if you dropped a ball on the floor, it would an egg. It would roll from one end of the house to the other downhill. Okay, so it was definitely not plumb anymore. I watched the door to their bedroom, an old rickety wooden door, was wide open. I watched it close uphill. I'm watching this, not like a vacuum where you open a door or a window and it sucks the door shut. No. It started, kind of stops, starts, keeps going, like somebody messing with it, and then it sped up and it shut. And I said to John, I said, you won't fucking believe this, my friend, what I'm looking at. I explained what I'm looking at. And by this point, my dog's fur's up, and she didn't growl or anything, if I recall, but she definitely was not impressed. So I walk over there and I look, and there's nothing. So I decided to keep the door shut at that point. I checked it; it's shut tight. The next evening, I went into the house. It was dark. Make a pot of tea, and I didn't bother to turn the lights on in the house. You had to either turn on oil lamps, you had to turn on a generator. So they had a gas range. So I just I had a miner's headlamp on. I'm in the house with my miner's headlamp on. My dog is sitting by my side. I'm looking down at the pot, not really thinking about anything. I was writing my novel. I was just like in another world. All of a sudden, I got that feeling being watched. And about that time, my big old fearless pit bull starts growling. She's just this really low. And I knew before I knew what I was going to see. Shined the light down the end of the house. That door was open, wide open. And I'm like, yeah. So I went and checked it out like you're not supposed to do. There was nothing. So that was like in Montana, that was the creepiest. That was probably the creepiest thing that happened. I don't have much explanation for that one.
Okay. And then you subsequently moved to, as we talked about earlier, the Hudson Valley.
Right.
And I think before we got on the radio and on this show, you also alluded to many strange things have happened over the last 2 years since we, I think, last spoke. I mean, and most people who follow you know that you almost died. So
right.
I don't know if that's where it starts or if it started before that. But what kind of strange happenings happened after you got to New York?
Overall, compared to kind of the weird stuff that happened in Seattle and Olympia, a couple weird things happened in Washington, but it was overall after we left that one place, it kind of calmed down. New York hasn't been remotely as active as some of the other places I've been, but I have had several weird things happen. We were living in this the last place. Jessica M and I lived there for 9 years, and it was a split level. It's a split level home. It's in the woods. You can see the Catskills. There's big fields. There's forests nearby. The whole thing. It's very Norman Rockwell, and the place is very, very old. And nothing really had gone on. I'd been living there for at least a year, and everything was fine. And both the dogs, at the time we had 2 dogs, and they were both in the office with me, and I was working on something, and something on my blind side crashed. Boom! It was very loud. And as I turned, my older dog is deaf. She was sitting up, confused, and the young dog we had at the time, she was she just darted past me and left the room. And she had been lying right near me, and she just boom, she was gone. And I looked over, and just in my blind spot, I had a couple bookshelves. In the space between them, I had a little table with a lamp on it and a bunch of doodads, big thick glass case candles and stuff like that. There's no way to rotate the table out from between the bookshelves. You'd have to pick it up and then pull it out. It was in there tight. So I'm looking at it. The table had been rotated all the way out, almost a 180. It was all the way 90 degrees. It was all the way out. And I experimented with it later. To get it back in, I had to pick it up, rotate it, and put it back down. And it probably weighed, I would say, with all the stuff on it, over 20 pounds. It was heavy. And so it had been rotated out from the wall and slammed on the floor. So that was, that was odd. I remember talking to my landlady about it. I came up with so many theories of, okay, what was that? I remember talking to my landlady, and I said, yeah, you ever anything odd happen around here? And she said, well, that top floor used to be my husband. He lived upstairs and she lived downstairs for the last couple years that he was alive. And he had passed away, and the room had been full of his books. I guess he hoarded books. It took a semi to haul his books away. And so she joked, oh, maybe he's, has something to say about you being in his favorite spot, that type of thing. So that was one of the odder things that happened there. Jessica reminds me periodically about the Pistachio Man. There's a little old country road that goes past the place, and I would say off and on for about 5 or 6 years that we lived there for 9, and for at least the last 6 or so, periodically there would be piles of pistachio shells right in front of where you could see through the trees to the house. I'm not saying that anything. I make no speculation about that, except that
maybe it's your biggest fan. just staking out
right.
the house and eating pistachios.
The thing that was interesting is that they were obviously not thrown out of a car. They were like literally somebody was standing there eating them and dropping the pile of shells there, and it was all up and down. There would be multiple spots, but it was always where there was a place where you could see through the trees and see the house. And so she never, and we walked that road all the time. They weren't anywhere else. They were just in front of our place. And I would say it became like sometimes 3 to 4 times a week. Other times it might go a month and you didn't see it, but then it would happen again. So that always, that was her one experience there. She didn't like whoever was standing there munching pistachios looking at the house, right? Because I had gone out at night and stood on the road because the mailbox is out there and just to experiment with that, to see what you could see. And yeah, you could have seen, if the lights were on inside, you could definitely have seen people walking around and doing stuff. So I'm like, I wonder if we have like a voyeur, but we never caught them, never saw anything.
Anything else that happened recently? I mean, well, tell us about the time you almost died.
Yeah.
Which was recently.
Yeah, it's interesting because I have had a lot of people ask me, has your attitude changed about the afterlife, religion, spirituality? Because I was, not only did I almost die, I was sick, deathly sick for a while. I got to experience all the stages of being sick. It wasn't sudden. It was a long, debilitating slide into hell, essentially. And my overall answer is not really. In some ways, I'm even more of a skeptic because I experienced a lot of hallucinations, which is just part of when I was racing sled dogs, I would go without sleep, frequently. And so I understand what sleep deprivation does to your mind.
So that's happened to me. I mean, it happened to me once, and I immediately discounted it as a hallucination. I mean, it was because it was so ridiculous. I was just really quickly. I was in training. It's called the Scout Platoon Leaders Course. It was in Kentucky, and they have this. The final event is like 5 days where you get 2 hours of sleep a night. So the entire time you get a little bit less than 10 hours of sleep. And one night, maybe 1, 2 in the morning, I was, just kind of sitting there, kind of just trying to stay awake. And I was in a Humvee, and I looked to my left, and there's the leprechaun from Lucky Charms talking to me, just talking to me, like, "Hey, how you doing?" So I'm like, "This is not real. This is clear." And then, of course, like one of the instructors is like blowing a whistle at me to wake me up because I was drifting off into. But sometimes I wonder if there's a liminal space where you're accessing, like your filter widens a little bit, and you're seeing stuff that,
Very
and
possible.
and that was just my interpretation of whatever I was communicating with. But again, for years I swore it's just a hallucination. You hallucinate when you are sleep deprived.
Well, I mean, I did acid one time when I was younger and had a trip. Uh, that's just anecdotal though, because I think to properly judge it, you'd probably, because there's so many different types and dosages and whatever, you'd have to do it multiple times to really understand what if that's a typical for you. Sleep deprivation. I mean, I've had some doozy hallucinations. I've had hallucinations from overdoing it with martial arts or weightlifting, like really extreme hallucinations based on that. Oxygen deprivation type of stuff. I've been choked out and hallucinated, and obviously so I had a bunch of hallucinations as I was getting more and more ill, and then of course after the major operation that I underwent. But the upshot being is nothing happened to me during my. It's kind of a paradox. On one hand, it hardened my skepticism. On the other hand, it also leads me to believe the stuff that I have seen that I can't write off as a hallucination is all the more potent to me. In other words, I'm not susceptible to simply, imagining stuff. I can tell when I'm hallucinating usually, or at least in retrospect. But yeah, like the main problem with the illness was I would have these waking dreams, and they would be, something to do with my physical condition. Like if you lie on this side or that side, you'll feel better. You'll be over this. And then I would think about that for 2 or 3 days, or you need to go home and do something. You left the computer on, whatever, right? And that would actually be an easy one to grab onto. Like I would have a nightmare about, oh, the computer's going to melt down because I didn't turn it off before I came to the hospital. And then all during the day, I got to tell the nurse to call, I got to call Jessica and tell her to turn the computer off. And then I'd finally at some point go, wait a minute, the computer's been off. She turned it off you've been in the hospital for 3 weeks. She turned it off, you know. So the dreams and hallucinations became so embedded in my reality that there was a stretch there where
You
I
couldn't distinguish between the two.
no, I'd have conversations and then go, nope, that was a dream. But I didn't, normally when you have a vivid dream, you wake up and within a few minutes, you're like, wow, what a dream. And then you forget it. I literally would forget reality. I would be living in the dream world. And it's very similar to what we writers like to dramatize it's a lot easier to dramatize it to get it across the reader. And yet it's very similar, very different, but also frighteningly similar to some of that stuff too. But it hardened my resolve as a skeptic. I was like, the mind can play the most intimate tricks on you that you really have to second guess. If it's improbable, you experience something that's improbable, you really need to work hard to rule out all of the plausible, no matter how fantastical they are. You need to rule these other mundane explanations out before you can start running around saying, I saw a Bigfoot or a ghost is haunting me or whatever it is. But I have come to the conclusion though that it's fine to be able just to say, I don't know what that was. I'm very good with that. Like I have all these experiences. I'm quite satisfied to say, I don't know, why that table rotated out. I have no idea. I don't need to leap to the conclusion that it was the ghost of the guy that used to live up the stairs. Was it? Hey, Stranger Things, Horatio, and all that. But
Well, look, here's another. Again, I'm just making this up on the spot. It could, like, what we perceive as ghost might be sort of an echo from that time period where maybe time is simultaneous and there's just, everything's a wave, and maybe that peak of that wave is the same time. In that moment for you, there was a peak and there was just bleed over or crossover. So they're other living people on a different frequency represented by time. Again, I'm not saying that's what it is, but
no, but that's that you've hit the nail on the head as far as I'm concerned, because I'm as much of a science fiction fantasy writer as I am a horror writer, and therefore a lot of my horror, I do come at it not necessarily from a hardcore science perspective, but I am interested in quantum physics. I'm interested in quantum entanglement. I'm interested in the observer effect. I'm interested in the idea that gravity is not that basically gravity bleeds in from another, through that basically the universe is a membrane or has a cellular structure. I love all
theory,
that.
right.
But that was the M-brain theory is what I used when I wrote my first the Imago sequence, the novella years and years ago. I was actually looking into that. So, there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm quite open to that. There's the idea that this seems to be becoming a mainstream idea amongst scientists that the idea, you said the word frequency, that everything's on a frequency, that there are parallel realities theoretically that we're having this conversation, but I have a mustache, that type of thing, or maybe nothing's changed. It's almost identical. So I've had the experience of somebody screaming, shouting, and it was overheard by someone else. I was on a school bus. I used to ride with a kid. He had special needs, and he would, every time we'd hit a bump, he would vocalize. A lot of times he would shriek. And one day he wasn't on the bus, and so I had to ride the bus to get back to my vehicle. It was just me and the bus driver, and the kid screamed. He screamed so loud the bus driver almost put us in the ditch. And I was in the very back. I looked up at him, and I said, "Now you heard that?" And he said, "I heard that." The kid was alive. He was fine. It wasn't a ghost, nothing like that. I have no. He wasn't. He was 5 miles away at his house. But the point is you have to wonder about a lot of this stuff that people see that can't just be ruled out as a hallucination, is it some kind of time dilation? Is it some kind of deja vu effect, writ large?
Here's a creepier story. I would just I don't know if you know who Lynn Buchanan is, but there was a movie. It was basically like a CIA like strategic communications exercise, right? It's called The Men Who Stare at Goats. You've seen this movie, right?
Which one?
The Men Who Stare at Goats. It's
Oh,
got
yeah,
like
yeah,
George
yeah. I've
Clooney.
seen that. Right. Matter of fact, when we were talking earlier, I was going to ask you if you'd seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is interesting, actually. So the George Clooney character is based on an amalgamation of three people, one of whom is Lynn Buchanan. And there's a scene. This is where it gets really weird. And in an interview, I think I kind of freaked him out a little bit because I injected some historical knowledge. So I'm gonna speculate about the end of it. But there's a scene where he's walking past these computer screens and they're glitching out. Right? You recall that? So that's based on a real incident that happened in Augsburg, Germany, back in 1983, and there was this big communications exercise that Lynn Buchanan was the senior NCO, senior sergeant running it, and there were a bunch of NATO generals who were present. And growing up, there was a lot of poltergeist activity that he had growing up, and when he would get angry, he would blow out like lights, stuff like that. So he learned to kind of keep his temper down. So, and by the way, this incident, most of the details around this incident are still classified. So he's presenting to these generals, and there's this sergeant that is working with them who wanted his job, right, and was bitter about not having his job. So he goes up to give this presentation, and when he kind of turns it on, it doesn't work or it's corrupted or something like that. And from the back of the room, the sergeant looks at him right in the eye and just says, "Gotcha," right? Lynn gets so upset that every skiff in on the European continent, and at least on NATO's side, goes out, just is zapped. Okay. And they can't figure out why. Nobody in the room really knows why. Lynn knows why. And so they're trying to figure out what's going on. They're trying to convey that everything's okay. And they're just, pretending to work and things like that. So there's no collective freak out. Years later, he found out that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the same thing happened. Okay, so this is in 1983. You know what happened in 1983, right?
Right.
Right. There was Operation Able Archer.
Right.
So they were doing this massive, the United States, NATO, doing this massive exercise about deploying forces into Europe. And the Soviets were convinced that we were trying to start a nuclear war.
Right.
So, and this is where the speculation is. And by the way, this is how he got recruited to the Stargate program. There's a General Stubblebine, heard about it and called him in and just kind of said, "So, what happened there? Did you do that?" And Lynn Buchanan was like, what do I say? He's like, "Yes, sir, I believe so, sir." He's like, "Outstanding. Let's see if you can do that to the Soviets on purpose." Right? Because that's what he was recruited for initially, to shut down computer systems. But the theory that is a potential theory is that may have been the trigger that almost caused a nuclear war in 1983 with that Able Archer. Right? Just imagine if you're the Soviets and all your skiffs, or your whatever the equivalent of a skiff is, your classified communication system winks out. What are you going to assume? Right? That it's
attack.
Yeah. So, and when I kind of brought this up in his presence, he got really visibly uncomfortable. So, who knows? It's just a speculation. But
I don't know if you ever read it. Vonnegut wrote a really brilliant story called I want to say it's called The Barnhouse Effect.
I haven't read it, but
it's in Welcome to the Monkey House. As soon as you get a chance, it's worth your time. It takes about 20 minutes to read it. Read it. And I want to say it was written in the 60s, whenever Welcome Monkey House came out initially. It was like, it had to be late 60s, early 70s. The story was written, but it is very pertinent to germane to your interests there.
Interesting. Well, the story I was going to tell you, I don't know how I got into Abel Archer, was this is a story he just told me. I just interviewed him recently. There was one of his colleagues, Mel Riley, in the remote viewing program, was at Fort Meade. This is sometime in the 80s, very likely, or early 90s. For some reason, he had an assignment and he was remote viewing like a Civil War battlefield at that time in history. And it got really intense. It felt like, Mel Riley described it as this, I felt like I was there. So anyway, they do this remote viewing. He kind of just writes down his impressions and all that stuff. And as they're walking out of the building to lunch, somebody stops him and says, hey, Mel, did you cut yourself? And he's like, what do you mean? He looks down and there's blood on his shirt. It wasn't his.
Mm-hmm.
So he brought something back. He apported something, but it was not his blood. There was nobody, they're in an office environment, right? Like it's just, so there's lots of things like that. And who knows? Like, I'm not saying it's paranormal, supernatural. There's just, we don't fully understand the nature of reality or the implications of quantum mechanics, at least to that scale.
No, right. And I've experienced on a lesser scale both of those. Before I forget, I should tell you about the doppelganger, because I've written essays about this. But before I move on to something else, let's
talk about that before you forget. Yeah.
So I was in a classroom though for a few years, special needs classroom, high school, and I was warned, after it started happening, hey, don't be afraid. The teacher, the classroom, she'd had a student die. Students died pretty frequently. Never while I was there, thank God. But they were medically fragile population. But we would get blood and urine, like on the there were like, I would clean the place, go back in. We're talking in the morning. Nobody's even there yet, and there'd be like drops of blood, like big dime-sized drops of blood in different places. And on two other occasions, there was urine, puddles of urine, like on exercise tables, like up high, that nobody had been on. And I thought I was going to be in trouble. I was like, I cleaned all this up. There was nothing here. And I remember the teacher going, no, that's so-and-so. Probably we've had this happen for years. I'm not saying that's what it was, but that in her mind, she didn't even blink. She just goes, yeah. I didn't want to say anything, but okay, now that you've seen it, this is what it is. And so there's that.
So like a student who died, like,
yeah, he was a special needs student and he had passed away. And I don't know if he died at school, but it was like in proximity to school, either on the bus or in school. And he had been in that classroom for 6 years, because you can go to school until you're 21. So they come in when they're 14, and a lot of them will stay until they're 21. And it was a self-contained classroom, kitchen, bathroom, therapy area, the whole thing. It's like, literally, it's like a little apartment, a suite. And yeah, I would say 5 or 6 times. I was there for 6 years, and at least 5 or 6 times, urine and blood, different places that there would been nobody there. It was like, it would happen in the morning when no one was around. So there was that. But in the last little anecdote I'll share, nothing creepy about it. I do buy into the idea of energy transference for several reasons, but one is I used to have a party trick that I did when I was angry young man. I could stop pretty much, I would say 80% of the time, I could stop someone's battery operated watch if I wanted to. I have no proof of it now. It's just anecdotal, but the last time I did it, nobody would do it after this. This guy handed me his watch that he'd gotten for Christmas. It was expensive. He goes, yeah, bullshit. Go ahead. And I held up my hand. I focused all my youthful rage at it. And it's funny you talk about anger. It only worked when I was mad. I'm just like, hand it back to him, and it was working. He goes, oh, it's working. And then it went dead. It was so bad though that I couldn't even the last 2 times I raced the Iditarod, you need to have a timepiece on you. I couldn't have anything in contact with my flesh. I had to carry like anywhere I could on my body, and of course the cold gets to them and destroys them. Uh, I have not tried wearing a watch in 30, 35 years because I can't wear one. I'm not a battery operated watch.
Yeah, so just I mean, it could be a lot of these, and I'm not saying that's what they are, but a lot of this phenomena that you're experiencing could be you,
Yeah,
right? Like it's a psychokinetic. I mean, I'm not saying it always is, but there are oftentimes, particularly with teenagers, where there tends to be a lot of or not psychokinetic, but poltergeist activity, and sometimes it's independent. Sometimes, well, I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows
right.
what's causing
But
it,
I think there is
but
a denominator. The last thing I'll say about
energy.
that is
Yeah.
I took a watch in to get fixed. You get a new battery put into it, like one of those grocery stores used to have the whole section where they sell guns and watches and the whole thing, right? And so I was having it repaired, and the guy said, "Oh yeah, that's really common." And by common, he didn't mean everybody. He just said people that can't wear battery operated. He says I have people that have skin conditions that the acid content of their sweat burns the rubber or will put holes or pit the metal. He goes, "Don't worry about it, kid. This is there are a lot more people out there that this is a sort of one flavor of problem that they have." But no, I was going to tell you before we run out of time, probably the most fascinating thing for me because it transcends my experience. Like if an intrepid reporter was ever to track down everybody ever knew, there's plenty of people that could tell you about this. Um, I've had a doppelganger kind of lurking in my back trail for since I was about 18. That started in Alaska, and I haven't had anybody talk about it in the last few years, but periodically, um, someone will say, I saw you, and it's easy to write off, right? I mean, we all look like somebody, but you know, I almost got shot by a state trooper one time because he swore that he had seen me doing something somewhere, and that turned out, nope, the guy who did it was taller. But so maybe that was, a case of mistaken identity. But um, no, basically, I would say probably 20 or 30 people over the years have said, I saw you. It was you. You waved to me. You went out of your way to let me know you were there, etc. Uh, One time when I was first dating my girlfriend in Seattle, we walked into a movie theater where she worked, and there were a couple guys, and she was talking to the guys, and they were kind of shifty, kind of street kind of guys, and they both saw me, and their eyes got big, and they started freaking out. And she says, "No, that's not him." And I said, "What?" And they said, "He held us up. He robbed our stash, man." And they probably went to their graves thinking I did it. They said, "It was you. It was just like 2 nights ago. I held them up in an alley and stole their pot or whatever they had." And I didn't. Um, I had people that would see me walking up and down the street. You name it, and it was so it got to the point where um, it doesn't surprise me at all when somebody says I saw you. It was you, not somebody looks like you. It was you. The common denominator for these is whoever this double is kind of mischievous or maybe even not very friendly. They're always like kind of shady, and they'll take off up an alley or they'll go behind a building or whatever. They won't come up like if this one friend of mine, he saw me at 5 o'clock in the morning walking down the street, and I said, "Well, there's other guys with patches," but that was across town. I was in bed. He says, "No, you had," and at the time I carried this big piece of iron that it looks like a harp, but it's a hand exerciser. And I carried that for the first couple of years I lived in Seattle, mostly as a self-defense weapon. But so I walked, and it was pink. Some jokers friends of mine had painted it pink as a prank. He goes, "I saw you were carrying that." And I said, "Well, then why didn't you pick me up? Because I was going to give you a ride." He was heading off to work or whatever. He said, "You just kind of waved at me, grinned, and then turned around and ran up an alley." And so I had lots and lots of those experiences.
Do these things happen when these things are often reported? Are they when you're at home sleeping, or otherwise? is it during times when you would be
All
somewhere else?
I know what you're talking about, astral projection, maybe all different times. Matter of fact, one of the times that somebody got offended when I denied it, there was a barista who was friends with me and not friends, but like we went in so often, like, hey, Shelly, how you? So me and my girlfriend would go into this coffee shop all the time, and the barista was really nice. And she said, hey, Laird, I saw you this weekend. And I said, really? And I hadn't been out. I said, where? And she goes, you were there was some tree work being done, you know, somewhere a few streets over, and I was stuck in traffic, and you were up in the tree taking limbs off the tree. And what was interesting is I don't know if she knew it, but I did work at a tree service at the time, but I never climbed. I was on the ground. I was part of the ground crew, and that was my day off. I never worked on a Saturday. I was at home, and she got really offended. She goes, "No, it was you." And I said, "Well," she goes, "You had the patch." She said, "You saw me and started yelling and waving to me." And I said, this person did what else they do? And she goes, you're kind of creepy though. I mean, I was a little creeped out because you were like grinning at me, you know, and like, like, like inappropriately, like unwholesomely. The grin was like, kind of psycho. And she goes, I thought you were just, pranking me. I said, that wasn't me. And I don't think she ever believed, and my girlfriend was there and she goes, no, he wasn't, he doesn't climb the trees. And also he was at home. The woman, it was so vivid to her. She wanted to believe me, but I don't think she did.
What do you think it is? Again, I mean, there's no way of knowing, but
Uh,
what's your best guess of what this is?
you know what? The, Here's the thing. The doppelganger has a really rich tradition that defies the obvious conclusion, which is simply we all have people who look like us. I mean, I have brothers, I have uncles, I probably have completely unrelated people that we have the same bone structure. Maybe they wear a patch. The thing is, the patch is not even reliable because a lot of times people will go, were you wearing a patch last time I saw you? Not everybody, notices things. But there are Jeff Ford, another great writer, he was relating a story about a famous doppelganger sighting. And I can't remember what it was, but it was like in Vienna in 1850, and it was at a boys' academy. And there were allegedly like 30 witnesses, like Harry Potter set up. They're all sitting at this long table, and the headmaster stands up at his throne and he starts lecturing the students. And his exact double steps out from behind the throne and is aping him like a jester. Looks dressed like him, looks exactly like him, and everybody except dead white. And he's got this horrible elastic grin, which is what is very common with my doppelganger. The grin is not right, and very pale sometimes. And so anyway, that was I don't you'd have to ask Jeff Ford because he's the one that dug it up. But it was like it's an actual you know sighting, and there's lots of stuff like that throughout recorded history of a bunch of people will see someone's double, and there's no explanation then other than there's two exact copies of a person. My theory then in that case is I'm not sure. I is it a is it the parallel universe thing? We're
Yeah,
existing in
but that would imply that some parallel universes are in on the joke and others are not. I don't.
well, right, exactly, right. I'm not sure what else it could be. And I played with the doppelganger theory in some of my stories, and the way I handled it is there's something inimical out there that likes to in
A
my
trickster.
stories. Yeah, but it's kind of a demonic trickster entity that likes to look like dead celebrities and things like that. Um, that is not necessarily my theory though, but it was just one that for the sake of a horror story, I thought was kind of
Oh, Andy Kaufman in your
right.
stories is a common
Exactly.
trope, right?
Yeah.
Not trope, but doesn't trope, but like a common theme in your many of your
Yeah.
stories.
Is that these entities they could look like anybody probably, but it amuses them, or there's some reason why they like to look like deceased actors and comedians, celebrities. I even went so far in one of the stories to say, in the modern era, contemporary era, you're going to see Andy Kaufman. If you were alive in the colonial days, or past if you were alive like around, the 20th, early or late 19th century, it might be George Washington you'd meet in the back trail, or somebody was, a famous writer from that era. Maybe you meet Nathaniel Hawthorne, um, or Wodehouse or somebody like that. So I, but that's not necessarily my theory. It's just something that's fun to play with. I don't really know, if it always took place at the same exact time, then I might be more sanguine about, oh, when you sleep, you project your consciousness or something like that. I really have no, I think what kind of unnerves me about it is I really don't have any idea what it is. It's not friendly though, at all.
And when's the last time you've heard one of these reports?
Oh, about 10 years, probably.
All right, well, that's good.
Yeah.
So any in New York?
The only thing I had in New York, and like I said, and this is, you take it with a grain of salt because it was just a fan that I don't know personally on Facebook, but they were swore up and down that I used to come into a casino in, I want to say, it was either Wyoming or Dakota, and that they were a reader of mine, and that I used to come in and I identified myself as Laird, and but I didn't wear a patch. I had a glass eye, and would play, whatever. I think she was a dealer, so I have no idea whether that's just her pulling my leg or not. But she carried on the charade for quite a while. Like, she said that it went on for several years, and she said even to the point where she knew it wasn't me. And I said, that's kind of fascinating. Did you ever interrogate this person? And she said that whoever it is insisted that they're you, even though I knew it wasn't you from just having talked to you on the internet and seeing your picture and stuff. But that they looked identical to you, same height, same everything, claimed to be a horror writer, the whole 9 yards. So I don't know what that's about. It could be there's somebody that looks a lot like me that is playing a game with her, that, which is, once again, we go back to it doesn't matter whether it's supernatural or whether it's completely mundane. It's creepy.
Yeah, it's your greatest fan genre, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, you don't want to have to write your own version of the misery novel. All right, now I think we have 10 minutes left, so I want to make sure that we have some time to talk about some of the work that you're putting out. So
Sure.
let's 5 more minutes go back to, I think, what we were talking about with the time you almost died. Some of the, you said you were having some hallucinations. Were there any hallucinations that you had that seemed real but were a little bit beyond kind of the mundane, turning off your computer and missing
Right.
work and that sort of thing? Yeah.
I had one really singular cosmic experience. That was, so I get to the hospital. I'm in the process of dying, as it turns out. No BS. I was within hours, and didn't really, I kind of understood that because I've come close before, but in a different way. And but you kind of understand your body shutting down. And a couple nights before they gave me the big operation, I was lying in ICU, and I had an out of body experience. Remember, I think I said earlier I've had like 3 or 4 that I can remember, and this was one of them. Um, I everything got really dark around, like there was lights on all around me, but kind of low, but they all disappeared, and I'm half awake, half asleep, but it was really visceral. All of a sudden, there was no bed anymore. There was no room. Everything became like I was in a coffin, and it was transparent.
It was like a
And
void, like a
yeah,
void, or
kind
okay,
of.
yeah.
Initially,
But by the way,
initially,
have you looked into near death experience? This is very
oh yeah,
common, by the way.
oh yeah.
Okay.
I've had a couple. I've drowned once and had to be brought back, so I have an idea. Um, Nothing too extraordinary, except just I can tell you that drowning, the first few seconds is horrible, and then it's very pleasant. Freezing to death, really horrible, and then it's very pleasant. Um, no, the room disappeared slowly, and I was still suspended, but I was like there was definitely glass, like transparent substance around me, shielding me. And there were stars. I was literally like on a Hollywood set. There were stars all around. much more realistic though, like what you might imagine in space. They were more spread out, and it got darker and darker and darker. And at the end, right before I kind of fell asleep, and stopped hallucinating, the coffin or whatever I was in began to constrict, and it got narrower and it flattened. And of course, for years I've always been taken with the idea that at the edge of the universe it flattens to a razor, like it's like basically if you were able to. I remember reading some scientist was saying theoretically at the edge of the universe where the matter is still going into the void, that you wouldn't be able to stand up. You would be compressed. So I'm sure that was in my mind, but I began to crawl like I did when I was in the incubator, and I had no I wasn't flattened, into like the Sunday paper, but I was definitely like crawling through like back into the womb kind of a thing. And it was pitch black. The only light that there was whatever surface around me was emitting. Like maybe I was emitting light. I'm not really sure, but there was no stars, nothing like that. The temperature was absolutely tepid. That's the other thing. I could tell that it was really, really, initially it was super cold I could tell like beyond the glass, you could feel the cold pressing in. But once we got into the deep void, there was no temperature. It was simply probably, blood temperature. It was just tepid. And everything winked out like a TV screen used to do when it would shrink down to a dot and then flatten out and be out. That was my consciousness. It just went, it was gone. And I remember when I woke up minutes, hours later, I don't know how long, I crashed back into it was literally, there was the sensation of falling back into my body. I was like jolted on the hospital bed.
And do you remember anything in between, or?
No.
Mm.
No, most of my experience with near death was really very, banal. It was very mundane. There was nothing, that was kind of, I don't place any emphasis on it because it was me hallucinating most likely, but it was, that was the most visceral experience I had. The thing is when I woke up, I remembered that didn't stick as a hallucination, or it did, but it didn't embed itself in other words, I didn't forget
it
that I dreamed it type of thing.
Have you ever kept like a dream journal at
all? Stories. Half my dreams, 2/3 of my dreams, they're interesting, turn into I put them in my stories, but I've never kept and sometimes I've written fragments down, but I've never actually kept a real journal. I probably should. Considering how many terrible dreams I have.
Well, you'd be surprised because sometimes they turn out precognitive. Like it is pretty eerie sometimes. I would say in the last 2 years I've had 2 or 3, where I would dream of something and I would, and in many cases with my channel, in the community notes section, I'll just write down the dream because it'll have a precog feel, and then 5 months later something will happen that's directly related to it. Doesn't happen often,
right?
But there's something to it. Again, the nature of reality is not something I think human beings fully comprehend. And if time is simultaneous, why wouldn't you have precognitive dreams? Because you're just accessing, a moment in a different frequency, right?
Like a solid state on your, a solid state drive, really. All that information.
Yeah. Or you're just a radio. You're turning the dial up. You're just.
That's actually how I used to describe it. As that all reality is a frequency on a dial, and you just on a band as a band, and you turn a little bit, and you're over, and you get in some stations overlap. You'll hear country and rock.
You get bleed through, right? You get bleed through.
Yeah.
All right, let's talk about some of the stuff you have coming out, because I know, you literally almost died, and thank God you survived. I think all your fans are very, very happy about that. I'm very happy about that. I wanted to give you some space before I reached out to you again, because I knew there's probably 1 billion people were going to be asking questions and things like that. So I appreciate you coming on this show. But what sorts of stuff are you working on now that you're appear to be back on your feet?
Yeah, I'm doing a lot better. I have pretty serious permanent problems, but I'm able to sit and talk and write. Uh, I still have. I- It could take me up to 7 years, I guess, to recover from the type of lung surgery that they did, but which was news to me. But I'm here. Yeah, I'm functional. Yeah, I've been. I have a collection coming out from Bad Hand Books. It's a contemporary horror collection called Not a Speck of Light, and that's coming out in about a little bit over 2 weeks. It'll be out on the 10th of
Okay,
September.
so people can pre-order it on
Yep.
Amazon, I'm guessing now.
Yep.
Yeah, so people should, or where else? I'm sure Bad Spec Books you can probably
Bad
get it.
Hand, right? You can get it from Bad
Bad
Hand.
Hand Books.
Yeah, I think those are the
Yeah,
two
I'm
major.
getting the title Not a Speck of Light confused with Bad Hand Books.
Yeah, and people always ask me what's the best place to order. I said whatever's good for you. Most local bookstores, if you go in there and say, "Hey, would you order this?" They'll order it for you. So I have that coming out. I've been working on short stories. I have a few short stories that are going to be trickling out. I want to give a shout out to Ellen Datlow. She has a reprint anthology called Fears coming out same day, September 10th, and I have a story in that. So let me shout her out. Uh, the other thing that I'm working on a bunch of dark fantasy horror. I've been working on that for about a decade, and I'm getting ever closer. I'm inching closer to releasing a big collection of that stuff. So, you know, um, you can kind of find that scattered out in the world right now. But eventually I'm going to collect it all. And I'll probably have a couple original pieces in there. But that's my big. That's really my big focus now. I'm still writing crime. I'm still writing everything that I have in the past. But my life's work right now, which this is something that came out of being so sick and almost dying. I had this big regret when I thought this might be it. Is that I didn't get to finish my dark fantasy collection. And anybody wondering what that means, it's if you think Michael Moorcock, Roger Zelazny, Gene Wolfe, Glenn Cook, if you take all those guys and then mix in the horror that I do, because there'll definitely be a horror element to most of it. I'm writing with those guys sitting looking over my shoulder, and I'm having a blast doing it. I just I'm every day is a gift is how I look at it, and I'm trying to use those days to get this thing done. But it's a big project.
Any final advice for the audience or words of wisdom?
Oh, it's cliche, but I tell people that you love them, and I would also just like to say to anybody listening to this that was aware of my struggle, nearly dying. So many of you guys wrote me notes, or you contribute to a GoFundMe, or you sent me emails, bought my books, in support. I really appreciate that. I was really humbled by. I never realized just how many people, cared, and that has caused me to look at life with sort of a renewed. I'm a cynical person, and that kind of took the edge off me. Um, I'm a little more. I try to be a little more joyful every day because of that. Um, I appreciate everybody. That was there for me.
People can also find you on Patreon too, right?
That's right. I have just look up Laird Barron at Patreon, and I have there's a free tiers that I try to a couple times a week. I put things on there so you can try it out, see what you think. And I'm not on social media very much, but I do have a Twitter account and a Facebook account, which I post updates on those. So if you're looking for news or whatever, you can either do the Patreon or one of my two social media accounts.
Do the Patreon. Definitely. All right. Well, thank you, Laird. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and it's good to see you again. It's good to see that you're back on your feet. So
Thank you
thank you
very
very
much.
much.